Going back around to Alex. Alex,
Hey,
Mary Beth, Stephen, and Nicole. What's your interest about, besides that it's required coursework, but any particular interest borderline and narcissism that you're
oh, I didn't even know what the exact topics were today. I just find psychopathology is fascinating, so I want to go to all of them. I think I've known someone who might have been borderline or I think partially borderline, and then narcissism is just fascinating. So yeah, sure, I'm in.
I'm sure you do know somebody who is has these characteristics. Mary Beth, what's interest in borderline and narcissism?
For years, I've been hearing therapists don't like treating people with borderline personality disorder. I'm curious about why that is, but I'm also curious about really getting into it and understanding it from that perspective, is just so that I know what I'm, just so I have some education around it, because I do think that we'll be treating people with borderline. And then with narcissism, I mean, it's pretty fascinating. It's so opposite of how I think about the world. Narcissists are just they're just fascinating. I don't have any other words other than that to describe it. But I've always been curious about narcissists, because I just think that how can you lack empathy? And it's like it's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's very human. It is very human. Stephen, and then Nicole.
I guess really just trying to understand the thought processes and behaviors behind both. Really trying to understand where they manifest from, and just both those personality disorders, just where they kind of really looking at them true points where they manifest from, which is really what interests me. And then also just understanding, more direct therapeutic interventions, methods on dealing with both. Just the foundation that creates an individual that kind of thinks like that. Just trying to understand that, especially from a family perspective, family structural perspective.
I guess to start, I think psychopathology is really interesting. When I took a psychopathology class, we actually didn't cover this area, maybe because we were looking at it from like a developmental framework and looking at children mostly, and it's not as common for children to express that. And I think you can't be diagnosed till you're 18,
Right.
So that's probably one of the reasons why we didn't really get into it. We talked briefly about antisocial personality disorder, just because it overlaps into another category. I think it's just a good, important topic to learn about.
First of all, kind of integrate all the things that we've talked about. One thing that Nicole is, and one because she's on the younger side, having just graduated from UC Berkeley, arguably, even though it's only at 18 when personality disorders are diagnosed, you probably saw a lot of versions of it. And you got to remember, every diagnosis is an extension on a continuum in terms of severity. The issues are very human issues and not necessarily considered a diagnosable issue until it causes enough problems. That's that reminder we talked about before, which is that when is it a disorder? When there is enough duration, enough dysfunction, so on and so forth, that causes problems. But arguably back in adolescent times, which all of us have gone through, is that you see a lot of borderline-ish behavior. You might even see a lot of narcissistic. One of the things we'll talk a little bit about is that I believe that adolescence is a stage of natural narcissism. It's distinctive from the narcissism that is truly dysfunctional. And there's we'll explain what and why that's how that's relevant. In other words, that the natural narcissism of adolescence developmentally appropriate in a lot of ways. Nicole said that she did a lot of developmental stuff in psychology in this area. I think I mentioned in the last seminar that arguably you can actually look at developmental theory in terms of attachment. Borderline personality disorder can be considered insecure or anxious attachment. The narcissist is considered the adult version of avoidant attachment. I think I extended it further to disorganized attachment, paranoid personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, a different form of anxious attachment, a different form of insecure attachment, the neediness and so forth. So, we'll get into that. I'm going to start with something I've conceptualized, which is drawn from all the different experiences about what foundations of relationships are all about. Whatever your personality is, it is what it is. So what? And the what and so what is that as it affects relationships. So it could be interpersonal relationships with you and family members, especially you and romantic relationships. And then as a therapist, you and your client. I know colleagues who have basically rationed themselves. They will only have so many borderline clients on their caseload at any given time, and they absolutely ration themselves on any given day, that the schedule to only have so many borderline clients because it can be so exhausting. And there's some reasons, that the borderline affect that, but also there's some reasons why you might be susceptible. So looking at what I call 5 foundations to relationships, because it will be, the narcissism or the borderline or the dependent or paranoid, any of those psychopath, antisocial personality disorder, histrionic, or whatever, is how they manifest in the relationship. That's going to be really important. In order to have any intimate mutual relationship, it could be a spouse relationship or a therapeutic relationship or somebody you just work with, in college. There's certain things that need to happen. And the intimacy varies according to the boundaries and requirements of the relationship. Work obviously is not the same as home, marriage, and so forth. But so the first one that I put out, the first foundation is trust. Do you trust this person that you're interacting with? I define trust 3 ways in terms of that. Trust is based on first of all, is somebody else's trustworthiness, which has to do with experience. Your experience with somebody else, are they trustworthy? Do they respond in a way that's reasonable, with decent boundaries, and with consistency? Sometimes I've used, those of you who worked with me before, I use this similar terminology: 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. If somebody does something 1 time, it's a situation, circumstance, bad luck. In other words, you look at the experience, and there might be a reason, excuse. If it happens 2 times, that's a coincidence. The issue is that it happens 3 times or more. That's a pattern, and so that's like experience. So trustworthiness comes from experience. So me trusting you, and everybody here except for Patrick, we've had experiences with each other, to more or less a relative degree. In those experiences, have we been to each other decent, kind, respectful, consistent, and so forth? Then of course it's easy to trust. Backing up a second to attachment theory and relating it to that. Attachment theory, one way to characterize attachment theory is that there's 3 or 4 issues in attachment theory. First is there is proximity. Is somebody going to be around? Are they going to be around and available to take care of you? Second one, in the taking care of you, are they nurturing, respectful, especially nurturing? So of course this is parents with children, babies looking to adult caregivers. Proximity, are they around and are they nurturing? And then are they consistent and available? So those 3, 4 characteristics. So trust is about experience, and the different attachment styles, the various types of insecure attachment: anxious attachment, ambivalent attachment, avoidant attachment, and disorganized attachment, versus secure attachment, comes from those experiences, which is based on trust. So what's your experience? But trust is based on not just on trustworthiness. In other words, is somebody available, consistent, and nurturing? It's also, you have to trust your own ability to make those judgments. You have to trust that when you pick, okay, this person's cool, this one's an okay, I'll take the chance. Do you trust yourself? The 3 great American lies are all based on trust. I'll still respect you in the morning. The check's in the mail. And very unfortunately, the third one is I'm from the government and I'm here to help. It used to be just funny. Now it's actually kind of scary that you can trust people. Trust is a big deal, but it has to do with experience. With the coronavirus going on now, not only is it scary in of itself, a lot of anxiety and so forth, but people with previous experiences of trauma, previous experiences of unreliability, in other words, trustworthiness, sense of the government or other people being trustworthy, is already directly challenged because of life experience. At a certain point, you call it, family of origin stuff, your psychodynamic family of origin background. At a certain point, it could be considered your neurosis. Experience makes a big deal. Trust, and besides experience, trusting that you're good at judgment. Now, who might you have judged as worthy to be trusted? Well, that's oftentimes your parents. Teachers, therapists, police, other people in authority, coaches, and so forth. And when you're a child, you have to trust because there's not any choices. Whether you trust or not, you're still beholden to those people. So some people have a real hard trouble time trusting because they don't trust their own judgment, because there were priests, there were Boy Scout leaders, there was coaches, there was an elder relative. But the third part of trusting is that as you manage those experiences, you get enough experiences to find someone to be trustworthy, and maybe you start to trust your judgment. But your judgment is never going to be 100%. So the third element is that you also have to be able to trust that you can survive being wrong. Can you survive being wrong? And that has to do with resilience, which is, that can't be disciplined. Back to attachment theory and the developmental part of it. Part of it, secure attachment, is the experience that somebody is around proximity and they're nurturing and they're consistent and available, is that they're not always around. Therefore, you actually suffer, get anxious, you get sad, you get depressed, but somebody always shows up eventually. Someone always shows up eventually and you get taken care of. In other words, you find that you can survive moderate, reasonable amount of negative experiences. And that develops into resilience, which allows you to take that forward into other issues. As I'm setting this out, you see how this is, projecting ahead into personalities versus how they manifest in relationships. This is the foundation. So when we later talk about borderline and narcissism, and we'll allude a little bit to dependent personality, paranoid, antisocial, and histrionic a little bit. You see how trust is implicated or is a huge part of issues within these personalities. The second thing besides trust is that, as complementary goes with it, is ability to be vulnerable. What's your ability to be vulnerable? Obviously, if you are vulnerable and there's someone trustworthy who is going to be just kind and nurturing you, it is your experience of vulnerability that it's relatively safe. But vulnerability can be really difficult for people depending on their background, also depending on gender roles, because men and boys certainly are not encouraged to be open and vulnerable about their feelings. I mean, how do you tease a boy? You tease a boy who expresses their feelings. Are they emotionally annihilated? And there's also various developmental aspects. Teenagers, preteens and teenagers, developmentally often have difficulty being vulnerable, or just the bad experiences that if you're vulnerable, you get annihilated. What's your ability to be vulnerable? And vulnerability has to do with opening yourself and giving yourself to somebody else. And it's a really huge part of intimacy. So, and you see how this relates to the personality disorders later on. So vulnerability is like, for example, for me and you to have a relationship, it's not only the trust, but the trust including issues of vulnerability. For example, one way to do it is that if I open up to you, if I lay my guts out on the table, my emotional guts on the table, like things that scare me, make me anxious, things that I might feel shame about, in doing so, I honor you. Basically, if I do this self-disclosure, I honor you, and I'm implying I think you're a good person. I think you're a good person. I think you're a kind person. I give you the opportunity to be kind and responsive in an appropriate way. Now, if you hold my vulnerabilities, I lay my guts out there on the table for you, and you treat it with kindness and respect, then the response is, that's good. You actually treated me well. That allows me to trust you. In bring up, I give you the opportunity. I honor you. I think you're a good person. If you respond well, then I go, I think this is a good person. If, on the other hand, you go, that's stupid. I don't know why the hell you do that. But Dewey stomp, then I'm going to go, whoa, not safe. I just had the experience to not trust. This is a bad thing to do. Now, once I do that, how does the relationship further develop? Well, then it becomes your turn. You're supposed to reciprocate by being vulnerable yourself. In being vulnerable yourself, you lay your guts out on the line, issues that are difficult for you, whatever else. And in doing so, you honor me. If you don't put yourself out there, that implies that you don't think I'm a good person, which feels insulting and diminishing. It's morally discouraging. But if you do, then I feel good. And if I treat you with kindness and respect, then the same dynamic happens. You go, this is a good person. And then I feel good. Now, with that increment of trust and willingness to show vulnerability, that much trust develops, that much intimacy in relationships develop. Whereupon, go again. I show you a little bit more, and I give you another chance. You respond well or don't respond well. If you respond well, then the trust increases. You reciprocate, and you show yourself to me. And in this dynamic of interactions and so forth, that's intimacy and the trust bond develops. This dynamic is problematic in personality disorders. It's problematic in personality disorders because sometimes when the intimacy is revealed, or either the intimacy is revealed, the other person does not respond as you want them to, then you're hurt. Or they do something that treads upon and feels insulting to those core issues of yourself, and you're hurt, and because of you don't have trust. To the degree that is pathological, versus is reasonable and appropriate, versus mind reading and heavy sensitivity, may be indicative of what we're going to talk about, which is borderline personality disorder. You anticipate and feel hurt more than you expect because the person doesn't respond appropriately, or does something that feels attacking. The borderline has problems with that. The narcissist, what they'll do is that in that response, remember I said there's a reciprocality there to it? I show you mine and you show me yours. We go back and forth, and gradually, because it's not like automatically happens one after the other and builds up. It can be sporadic time, moments where things are rather flat, and then there's jumps in the intimacy. But what the narcissist will do is that they can be available to hear and be kind and be respectful to the other person, therapist, partner, colleague, and so forth, can be responsive to their needs, be kind and nurturing, but they won't reciprocate. they won't show theirs, because showing theirs makes them vulnerable, and they're not willing to do that. And that's probably akin to avoidant personality. Well, it's a version of avoidant attachment. It could be as extreme as avoidant personality disorder, but the narcissist has a version of that. In order to make this happen, to do this process of building trust, being vulnerable, and so forth, you have to be able to self-express. You have to have, this is two sides of communication. This is the first side. This is expressive communication, where you're putting it out, versus receptive communication. So about self-expression. To self-express, you have to be introspective. You have to be able to look into yourself. And in looking into yourself, you have to have, it's important to have insight. Do you know why and how you think the way you think? Mary Beth was talking about being challenged by dealing with narcissists, because as you are aware of how you think and how you process things, that gives you a leg up to start to figure out how somebody else figures things out and sees things. However, if you're not even really aware of how you process, you're not introspective and so forth, you don't have to figure things out, it's pretty hard to make that comparison. There's a saying about Americans that Americans don't know how we're Americans until you get out of the country. We're experiencing versions of this now with the coronavirus and the quarantine, is that we didn't realize how many freedoms and how many things we took for granted until the quarantine. Now we realize there's all kinds of stuff that used to do automatically without even thinking about it, that you have to really think about it, consider, is it appropriate, is it not appropriate, is it safe? So to be insightful about that, you need to be introspective. There's a developmental aspect of that, which is that younger children tend not to be so introspective, nor are they necessarily so insightful. So this is why younger children, but also therapy in general, often involves having that exchange, asking people what do they think about something. And some of it is you might be giving them actual feedback, but in asking the questions, you might be prompting them to discover or understand their own processes. As opposed to my therapeutic style, I tend to be more psychoeducational. I tend to be more provocative and willing to put things out there. There is a form of therapy, a style of therapy, which is kind of an evocative style of therapy, which basically it's about working with somebody, client-centered, and you let them run the show. They generate the energy and direction of it. And that works pretty well for somebody who's insightful and has certain kind of maturity, self-awareness, and so forth. But on the other hand, there are people who aren't able to do that because of their own personal issues, their own processes, also developmentally. So what I tend to do is that I make guesses. I ask about things, and sometimes I'll say, is this what's going on? Or I'll ask, what do you think is going on? And in asking the questions, then I'm poking at them to be introspective, look at themselves. The question could be, what do you think that's about? What do you think that's about? How are you feeling about that? What does that make you feel? And then maybe the other question, a little bit more pointed to insight, is where does that come from? When was the first time you experienced that? If you had this anxiety about getting in trouble, do you remember who was one of the first people that you had this experience with where you had this anxiety? So what I'm prompting there is for them to be introspective and insightful, but also prompting them, so to self-express, you need to be introspective. You also need to be insightful. You also need to be connected to your own feelings and process. So the question of what do you think that's about, and how did that make you feel? How do you feel now? Do you remember where that feeling originally came from? Those are all promptings about it. And then with that, the process of articulation, to express what you feel, express what's going on. So part of what my particular style is that I will make guesses, but in making guesses, a couple of things happen. I prompt people to be introspective. I offer my version of what I think might be going on, which is possibly insight. If it's accurate, they can take hold of it and own it. And actually, that is a kind of a form of what I described first about putting out their vulnerability, is that they weren't able to put it out, their vulnerability, because they weren't insightful. They weren't introspective and insightful. They couldn't put it out for it to be honored. But basically, therapeutically or relationship-wise, I reach over to where I think the vulnerabilities are, handle it with kindness and respect, and say, is this what's going on? And if I'm accurate, they can own it, and then they can expand upon that. The thing that's really brilliant about it in some ways is that even if I'm not accurate, even if I'm even just wrong, but especially if I'm a little bit close, what will happen is, as I'm a little bit close, the client or the other person, especially in therapy, the client might correct me. They might correct me and say, no, it's not. No, it wasn't my mom that I was worried about. It was actually my older sister. Well, in correcting me, they find their truth. They connect the introspection and the insight just develop. And also, sometimes when I say I make the guesses, something may happen is that somebody talks. Actually, this is a connection of all these things. So I had a client in the parents' divorce and immigration processes. He was left behind in another country with one parent when he was about 3 years old. 2 years after that, the other parent immigrated as well, and he was left behind, cared for by other relatives. And he said, and then they reunited and everything else, 5 years later and so forth. He thought he was done with it. Classic male kind of response and cultural things fit in there. But then as I poked him and started thinking about it and what it was all about and everything else and feelings and so forth, I said that must have really, really been hard. And my tone, really, really been hard because the two foundations, one after the other, a connection of attachment had, they both abandoned you. As a 3 and 5 year old, how can you possibly understand? And your grandma, whoever took care of you, they would love you, but it must have been really, really sad for you, that sense of abandonment. And so I'm actually articulating for him. Mary Beth and Stephen, maybe Alex too, you guys actually might know the rest of the story. This is something that came up with a client in terms of his background. They were seeing me in couples therapy. A couple months into the therapy, they had gone on a trip with some friends, pre-quarantine, pre-virus stuff, and they were bar hopping, club hopping in some tourist place. There was a little miscommunication. The partner and the other pair of friends left the club and left him behind, not realizing that he wasn't following them. After a few minutes when they were in front of the club, about to go to the next club, the partner realized that he had been left behind and went inside to get him and found him right away. And then for the rest of the night, he was in this really funky mood. Didn't want to talk, was quiet, seemed kind of angry and stuff. And then finally back at the hotel a few hours later, the partner asked, what the hell's going on? How come you're so upset? You seem to be, several times during the rest of the night, they had asked him, are you okay? Are you okay? I'm fine. Nothing. I'm fine. But finally back at the hotel, they asked, what's going on? What's going on? And then he said, you guys abandoned me. I fucking hate being abandoned because my father and my mother abandoned me.
Uh-huh.
Bam. The articulation, the connections. It was huge. Oh my God, it was huge. I'm just sitting there listening to them. And I feel like crying because it's such a huge therapeutic connection. I've actually gone back and told them, I'm going to tell your story to other people. I'm not going to review your identity because this is huge. What a huge breakthrough because the introspection, the insights, the connection, and be able to articulate it. I fucking hate to be abandoned because I was abandoned. My parents abandoned. And then the partner could say, oh my God, I get it. And they could clarify, they weren't abandoning him. They just made a misstep and could totally identify, respect, respond to the feeling of abandonment. Huge. So the self-expression. So sometimes therapy is about teaching people how to be introspective, how to, figure out insights, getting them connected to their own process and history, how and why they become the person they are, how their feelings and emotions get wrapped up in their processes, and be able to articulate. That's particularly an issue with boys and men at times, because boys and men don't have the cultural, social training to communicate about emotions. Guys are even taught, even punished if they express their feelings, be vulnerable. So, there is a part of that which is part of therapy. So that's the self-expression part of it, okay? Now, with personality disorders, the expression is often in a kind of a code or distorted, problematic. So, and maybe one of the ways to look at a personality disorder is that the mechanism, the behavior of personality disorders are communications of self-expression. And what are they expressing? Okay. So the shorthand for borderline is that the acting out behaviors, the lashing out behaviors, is expressions of deep despair for betrayal, abandonment, and rejection. BAR, betrayal, abandonment, and rejection. But that's what the behavior is all about. That's the communication. And in that sense, they're not introspective enough or have enough insight connected to their older process policy of attachment losses and trauma, anxious attachment. Not identify their process, how they transfer that abandonment or betrayal or rejection from a parent to this work colleague, to this boss, to this intimate partner and so forth. And then, that we're actually trying to teach them to articulate these needs differently. So, and a narcissist is a version of that as well. So, trust, being able to be vulnerable. Narcissists, if I should have said, if it wasn't already clear, narcissists have a hell of a time being vulnerable. They do not let themselves be vulnerable. Okay? Whereas borderlines are vulnerable all over the damn place in a way that can be suffocating. Trust, be vulnerable, self-expression. The fourth one is be able to empathize, or in other words, receptive communication. How to receive the communication, So, and receiving the communication has to do with being able to listen carefully. But listening is more than understanding. So you listen to understand the facts of the matter, but you're also really listening to empathize and relate to and identify the emotional content, the emotional message. So what is the process of doing that? So if it's working with a borderline or a narcissist or anybody else, is that if someone rants and raves, if somebody doesn't show up to a meeting, if somebody, is sloppy and does something that doesn't feel quite right, what is that about? If that's a communication. Can you relate and identify to it beyond the overt, oh crap, they said something mean, they didn't show up. What does that actually mean? Figuring that out is the part. And the other part of it in terms is that the receptive communication for the borderline and the narcissistic person and any other personality disorder, they have characteristic ways to receive, receive communication. Mary Beth asked about BAR. BAR, B-A-R, betrayal, abandonment, rejection. Betrayal, abandonment, rejection. Is what that stands for. And I have some other ones. It's a shorthand if you look at that. So in terms of receptive communication, the borderline has an extreme sensitivity to interpret something as betrayal, abandonment, rejection, because all of the previous life history. Narcissists have a receptive communication prejudice to interpret communication that is challenging their competence, challenging their power, control, and their image. So they respond to that. So there's a certain style. It's kind of like the idea that a bull, responds to a red pig, or that there's certain display behaviors among animals that are invitations to mating. These are cues, And obviously there are, racist and sexist cues that people respond to that can be highly problematic as well. But so the receptive part of it, which is to truly empathize, The classic issue with a borderline is that their partner or somebody else does something pretty innocently. They're 5 minutes late coming to the meeting. They put they order that food instead of this food, and or they don't respond to the text message right away. And the person goes ballistic. Well, they're going ballistic because they feel betrayed, abandoned, rejected. They're preset. They're highly sensitive to it. It's interesting that even though this is called borderline personality disorder, and there's a different personality disorder called paranoid personality disorder, there is a paranoia there. There's a sensitivity and a vigilance about betrayal, abandonment, rejection, which we all have, probably to some degree. We all have to some degree, And then what happens is that it becomes hypersensitive and hypervigilant for somebody with more issues and more negative experiences, to a point of actual paranoia, where you interpret it so negatively. Alex commented about walking on eggshells. Alex, you want to speak to that a little bit more? Because this type of you know um, this is about people, and this is why when I asked you guys earlier, and some of you said, yeah, I had some experience, maybe. This is so normal. I mean, this is so human. It's just kind of more or less the degree of it. And us as individuals, we have our own issues too, feeling threatened, uh, betrayal, abandonment, rejection, competency, competition, image, and so forth. Alex, you have a
I know people who are in families where their father was alcoholic, and they always describe it as walking on eggshells. They couldn't, like the fathers would react so aggressively or violently to anything. And it makes me wonder how many borderline people are alcoholics or vice versa.
right. Well, there's an awful lot, and the estimates, according to some researchers, is that it's about 1% of people might be diagnosable as borderline personality disorder. 1-2%, not a lot. And the same thing for narcissists, 1-2%,
Hmm.
which is really not a lot. Actually, the personality disorder that is supposed to be the most prevalent is OCPD, or obsessive compulsive personality disorder. The neat freaks, the things that have people who need to have things orderly and in place. And I'll repeat what I said last time, which is the difference between OCD and OCPD is really important. OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, and OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, they both have issues around anxiety about having things being orderly and in place. But the thing about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which we hear about all the time, is that even though they check the door a dozen times to make sure it's locked, and even though they put things in order obsessively, and they think about things obsessively and they compulsively behave in certain ways, it doesn't stop their anxiety. It doesn't reduce their anxiety. They stay anxious. Versus OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, when that person makes it neat and orderly, they calm down. They're relaxed. They feel good. This is like Felix Unger in The Odd Couple, or Seinfeld, Jerry Seinfeld in the Seinfeld show, likes things orderly. And in some work situations, it's kind of nice to have somebody with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, because they keep everything neat for you. Somebody at my years ago, somebody at our school that was like that. She was always walking around, tidying things up, making things neat, which meant that things were organized. Things didn't get messy, and it calmed her. And the conflict there, just like the Odd Couple TV show and movie, is that if you're not that obsessive compulsive about things being orderly, it can infringe on your freedom, your creativity or whatever else. But the person calms for it. So obsessive compulsive personality disorder is considered actually probably the highest, most prevalent personality disorder. The reason borderline and narcissism seems to be so much more prevalent is these are really dramatic personality disorders. And how are they dramatic? They're dramatic, and they're worthy of making movies about, worthy of making stories about. And because the borderline, those are the drama people, the drama queens and kings and whatever, who are always having upset, throwing people shit out on the sidewalk when there's a fight, disagreement. The narcissists are driven for leadership, which is why they are so prevalent in sports, the arts, music, and business and politics, because they become, they rise to the top because they're so competitive, they're so image driven. So they are more noticeable, because of the others. And they're a real pain in the butt because of that, especially if you don't understand. So, anybody else have any thoughts? Because let me add this the fifth element of relationships as a foundation looking at personality disorder. So there's trust, being vulnerable, self-expression, which is expressive communication, being able to empathize is just receptive communication, and then investing in a relationship. A relationship doesn't happen unless you invest in it. Okay, when you invest, then you risk trusting. You try to be vulnerable. You work on your self-expression. You work on your compassion, understanding, and so forth. It makes sense because you're invested in the relationship. However, with a borderline or a narcissist or any other personality disorder, is arguable what they're investing in. For example, the narcissist is invested in the relationship to manifest their omnipotence, their grandiosity, their self-righteousness, and their entitlement. In other words, it's not a mutual relationship. It's not even a relationship that actually has boundaries that, it could be a work situation where there's a hierarchy, supervisor and supervisee. But, so the supervisory relationship is that, here in this situation, I'm the instructor and you all are students. Dahlia does some major, infrastructure and other stuff for Wiser. But, so there's a hierarchy here. But in the hierarchy, then this hierarchy serves, I'm the instructor and you're the students. I'm supposed to help you learn, grow, and develop. That's the role, And if you give me that and I try to do that, that works fine. However, if the hierarchy is that having you as my students is to fluff up my self-esteem, to get my sense of power and control, to feed my ego and so forth, it becomes problematic because that doesn't serve, the actual overt structure that's supposed to be there, and the overt roles. So the investment, now in a mutual relationship, in terms of intimacy of partners, there is that's a big issue. So why are these two people a couple? Well, because one wants to be dominated and the other wants to dominate. One needs to be told what to is afraid to make decisions, and here's somebody else who make decisions for them. So the investment is to do that. Also, a lot of you will be working with individuals and couples where when someone gets in a relationship, the investment it's such a cliche, but something along the lines of that. I couldn't get my father to be emotionally connected and available to me, so I'm gonna get you to do that for me. You're gonna confirm to me that I have value and lovable because I couldn't get my dad or my mom to do that for me before. And when that plays out, people get in really dysfunctional relationships. So the investment is not to have a mutual bidirectional nurturing relationship, but what happens is that it's more about that I'm using you to heal myself or to deal with the psychological damage, but then doing it unconsciously. So the investment part is really problematic versus a mutual investment. You saw Alex's comment. I think it was really appropriate about the movies got all kinds of stuff about narcissism and borderline and so forth. So the investment part of it. Other people, you guys have some thoughts about this kind of framing of relationships and what it suggests for the dynamics that come out in personality disorder people? What do you observe? Comments or thoughts?
Well, I was wondering in my comment, it was actually, it seems like a thing where someone in a couple tries to convince the other person in the couple that they together are going to rule the world. Screw everybody else. We're the only ones that matter. Us too. It's not us. It's not just me. Like, what kind of narcissism is that? Where you think you as a couple?
I'm going to talk about that. Well, actually, let me address that right now. Two things. First of all, is that I found this great article when I wrote my book about couples therapy and narcissism. And basically, it likened nationalism as a countrywide
Uh,
narcissism.
yeah.
You know, what Hitler did with Germany and the Nazis, the Aryan thing, you know, what some people in our country do, where they make America, that we're special, and we hold this moral supremacy. Um, and it's a way to exploit and get power, but nationalism as a form of national narcissism. Uh, I think it's pretty relevant, very, very powerful.
Mm.
With narcissism, there are partnerships with narcissists. Basically, a narcissist, we're getting a little details of it, that's fine. You know, so one of the ways I characterize narcissism in terms of four key experiences or characteristics. Narcissism, there's omnipotence, which is I am the best. I'm better than everybody else. That's omnipotence. Grandiosity, second characteristic, and grandiosity is that I'm special. I'm special. I'm not like the ordinary people, the small folk, the muggles, the peons and so forth. I'm special. Omnipotence, grandiosity, related very much to that is self-righteousness. Self-righteousness is not that you have a strong moral code, and there's things that you believe in, but that you hold the high moral ground, the moral high ground. That everybody else is somehow deficient, corrupt, degenerate, blasphemous, if they think and feel differently. You hold the high moral ground of self-righteousness. Now, I believe, and everybody should have, I believe that I have a strong moral code. There's a strong moral code that incorporates respect for other people. Other people might have different religious, philosophical, and other moral values and so forth. They're not the same as mine. And it's right for me. So I have my sense of true north as opposed to I alone possess the true north. Anybody else who isn't aligned with me somehow, infidel, blasphemous, has to be destroyed. So, and this is what's key is that the omnipotence, I'm the best, the grandiosity, I'm special, the self-righteousness, I hold high moral ground. These are the fourth characteristic, which is entitlement. And entitlement is crucial because entitlement means that the rules don't apply to me. The rules apply to the regular people. Everybody else should wear masks to prevent infections, possible COVID infection spreading, but I'm not going to. Everybody else is to be held accountable for saying racist, sexist, xenophobic, religiously insulting things, but I can say things like that. The rules don't apply to me because I'm the best, because I'm special, because I will have more now. And that entitlement is key. Okay? Entitlement is key because once you have the entitlement, because I think I'm one of the better people in terms of certain skills and aptitudes, in terms of therapy and training and so forth. I think I'm really good. I think I have rare qualities that aren't super common, or they're not widely common. I'm not in the middle of the bell curve in certain skills and so forth. So that makes me somewhat special. And I do have a strong moral code, what I believe in. However, those three things that I have, I know the rules apply to me. If I'm an asshole, people won't like me. I'm not entitled to be lecherous, greedy, to be exploitive, to hurt other people. I will be held accountable for it. What I do matters. I don't have that. I don't have that entitlement. That's a really key issue. Now, this is a long way to get to the answering your question, Alex. But, so, who the hell gets into relationships with people like that and stay in relationships with people like that? Why the hell would you be in that relationship where every once in a while, that if you are on their good side, basically this is one of the characteristics of narcissism, is that either you are clearly inferior, a subordinate, and as a subordinate, you can either join their cult of admiring the narcissist, or you become irrelevant to be dismissed because you're beneath contempt, you're not worth the trouble to pay attention to. You know? Or you're clearly superior. You're clearly superior because you have more money, more power, more status, or you're an expert in some other field. You know, so like you will see narcissists who are experts in their field, renowned, but they respect somebody in another field who's also renowned. It's a different field. You also see people who are experts in their field, but there's somebody who's an icon in their field. I like sports, but Bobby Knight, Indiana basketball, was notoriously narcissistic basketball coach. Very successful. But he totally admires John Wooden, Pete Newell, icons of basketball, of coaching, because they're way up there. The issue is that for the narcissist, if somebody is equal to them, and this is highly problematic because, and maybe Mary Beth, this is part of what you talk about why it's so difficult, is that if you approach somebody as an equal, that you have shared humanity and you have shared experiences, and that you might be different, but you're essentially equal, so in terms of rights and so forth, then the narcissist, because you're not clearly superior and you're not clearly inferior or pandering to differential, instead of being a colleague, you actually become a rival. You become a mortal enemy. People are beneath and people are clearly ahead. They're not in competition with them. But somebody who comes to you as equal, there's this issue of competition. And one of the characteristics or way to describe narcissism is this profound sense of inferiority, profound, deep attachment wound of being abandoned or rejected, possibly by parents, or indulged, which is a different type of issue, which I'll get back to in a little bit, is that you have this profound insecurity about your worth and your image. So anybody who comes within a range of being comparable becomes a mortal enemy, a competitor who will take away your spot, push you off the spot. So you have a lot of history of people who, in politics, in business, in sports, the arts, and so forth, who were mentor-mentee relationships. The narcissist being the mentor, and the mentee, somebody who's coming up with talent and so forth, who is loved, honored, supported by the narcissistic leader. But then when the mentee starts rising in competence, rising in status, rising in power, the mentor will turn on them, try to destroy them. In the entertainment world, there's a really good book called Disney Wars about Michael Eisner. He was the head of Disney, and Robert Katzenberg was his protege. And he mentored him. But Katzenberg was really brilliant and really smart. But eventually, and Katzenberg started DreamWorks, which is you see producing films and so forth. When Katzenberg started rising in status and so forth, Eisner turned on him and tried to destroy him because he couldn't deal with him being comparable. So this is why it's how in the world. Why would you work with someone like that? Because of that competition, because of the inability to tolerate someone being equal, will turn on you and try to destroy you wherever it wants to. You're the mortal enemy. Well, if you're a therapist and they're your client, then it's already very difficult for the client who's a narcissist because they have to defer to you as a therapist, and that's why there's these various battles between therapists and narcissists. We'll get into a little bit more later on. But in anything other than a work-structured relationship where the hierarchy is part of the work, narcissism is even more challenging. In the work situation, if your boss is a narcissist, that's your boss. You have to put up with that crap more or less if you have to stay at the job. Why would you put up with that? Because you have to keep the job. But if you don't have to keep the job, people get the hell out of it because they don't want to tolerate that. If they disagree with the boss or the boss finds them challenging, the boss will annihilate them, cut them off at the knees. So, why? Because you have to. Until you don't have to, you get out of it. And Now, the other thing, however, in a mutual relationship, back to what Alex is saying, again, long answer to get to this, is that why would you put up with a narcissist as an intimate partner or even as a friend? Family, you're stuck with them for different reasons. Certain situations, the hierarchy is established as part of the community. And you might stay there because you want to be part of that community. But why in an intimate relationship would you put up with somebody who's also who is narcissistic? Because periodically they will annihilate you. Periodically for their own egos, they're being threatened, there's the need to be omnipotent, the grandiosity, self-righteous, and the entitlement. They will emotionally annihilate you, put you down some horrible way. So the answer why is that there are certain pairings. And some of those pairings are, one's a non-personality disorder pairing, and the other four are personality disorder pairings. So what's a classic pairing with a narcissist? A classic pairing with a narcissist is someone with borderline personality disorder. Why borderline personality disorder? Because someone with borderline personality is so desperate for attachment, so desperate to have somebody be with them, care for them, to supposedly love them, that they will put up with incredible crap, occasional annihilation, because they're so desperate to have that relationship. So occasionally, when you do couples therapy, you see a couple that come in, one borderline, one narcissistic. Yeah, that's the question. Who would put up with that crap? Someone who's that desperate. And what you also will see is that they usually don't come to therapy because the narcissists won't put themselves in a position of being told anything or deferring to the therapist's authority. But the borderline submits. That's one of the answers. Who else will accept that? Dependent personality disorder. Dependent personality disorder is just low self-esteem, just a poor sense of security. My experience with dependent type personality is that they will keep on asking me over and over in therapy, what should I do? Is this okay? Sure, it's okay. They'll say something, and they'll look to me for approval, so forth, because they're unable to affirm for themselves their own value, their own thought process, their own needs, and so forth. So they're hugely dependent, again, on attachment, on somebody to take care of them and to tell them what to do, which answers the question, who the hell would put up with being annihilated periodically with someone who's that desperate for attachment and a partner? That's the dependent. So that's two of them, borderline and dependent partnerships with narcissists. Third one would be histrionic. Histrionic has low self-esteem, and they get their sense of self through the reflected glory of who they're hanging out with. So in other words, if you're young, pretty, and your sense of self comes from being young and pretty, but you don't otherwise have enough sense of self, self-worth, integrity, and so forth, what are you going to do? You're going to hook with this older, gnarly, rich, powerful dude, which we see lots of examples of that in our modern world, because you get the reflected glory of being attached to this powerful, in a lot of cases, this powerful man who is very, very strong and so forth. And there's a characterization of narcissism as being significantly male. I think it does fit oftentimes. However, in the LGBT community, you see the narcissistic dynamic as well, where you often see a younger person in their 20s in a partnership with somebody who's in their 40s and beyond. The person in the 40s beyond often has money, often has career, and they take care of the younger person, and that just smacks of the narcissism and control dynamics that it allows the bear or the top or the whatever you want to call it to remain superior in that dynamic. So this is pervasive. It happens all over the place, no matter what, if it's narcissism. But the histrionic, basically, their glory is being attached to somebody famous or wonderful, So why would someone put up with that? Because that's how they get their sense of self. Now, what Alex is talking about is House of Cards, right? House of Cards, where Kevin Spacey and Robin Wright, two narcissists, both of them have power and so forth. So who puts up with a narcissist? Sometimes another narcissist. Usually a narcissist with a complementary but not directly competitive field necessarily. Because basically, I and my narcissism, omnipotence, grandiosity, self-righteousness, entitlement can wreak havoc, control, dominate this other in this field or in this arena. And you could do the same in your field. And basically, we kind of relish each other's evil. In House of Cards, there's actually a scene where when Kevin Spacey speaks to the camera and his wife, Robin Wright Penn, or Robin Wright, I guess it is now, talks about how she wants to get vengeance upon somebody because of something that happened. And he turns to the camera and says, I don't know whether to admire her or be scared of her. Basically, he enjoys how vicious. I make that analogous to Stalin and Hitler forming their alliance. Here's these two omnipotent, powerful people. Actually, I heard stories about Steve Jobs and who's the guy from Oracle? Oracle Computer. Anyway, but the two of them doing some mean stuff, manipulating low-level workers just for fun, and they're kind of enjoying each other's evil, so to speak. So the narcissist is that pairing that you're talking about. And what it is that there's two people, arguably with avoidant attachment, who have truncated relationships. The deal is, I get some glory in having this hotshot, powerful partner, and that's what you get as well. But deeper intimacy, we won't do that because neither one of us. Does that make any sense to you, Alex?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. You don't see it as often. The fifth one, which is a non-personality disorder one, to me is very fascinating. Over many years, I'd run into people, and since I was working in child development world and therapy world, oftentimes women who were just these amazing women. They're just amazing women. They're like phenomenal. They tend to be in their 40s or thereabouts, attractive across the board, intellectually, physically, incredibly heartful personalities. You're just like the greatest, just awesome people. And in our conversations, I found out that they were divorced, and earlier when they were relatively young, they got married to, but they were taught to be a narcissistic asshole, and they were married to this narcissistic asshole for 10, 15, 20 years, and then eventually they got divorced. And I'm just kind of like perplexed. It's like, why the hell you, who I find amazing, attractive, that you probably could have the pick of the litter in terms of relationships and so forth. Why did you settle for this narcissistic a-hole, And there was a series of women that I'd run into who did that. And I think I figured out an answer. Does anybody have a theory about this? I might have told some of you guys this theory already. Anybody have an idea of what that might be about, where that comes from? Because in talking with them further, I found they had something in common.
Mm.
It wasn't the borderline stuff. It wasn't the histrionic dependent personalities. Any guesses? Nicole, Mary Beth, Stephen, Alex too. Contact, you could also do it online. Talia, any ideas?
Father figure.
Maybe.
They needed a father figure. That man reminds her of her father,
Right.
and she's forever that little girl who is unhealthily attached to a father figure.
A little bit more than that. But that's part of it. Maybe. Maybe other thoughts?
They,
Mary Beth,
yeah, they really liked to be charmed and like feel like they were this, like, because isn't that part of the initial relationship is that they get that the narcissist charms the other person.
And narcissists tend to be very charming.
Yeah.
You cannot be a crude narcissist. You cannot be a untalented narcissist. It doesn't work. You have to be charming. Okay, I'll tell you what it is. Interacting with them and talking with them. And the interesting thing was that most of them weren't clients, people I interacted with. Every one of them, part of their childhood history was through abuse. They were abused as children. They were either sexually abused, if not physically, but certainly emotionally abused. And the way that, and this is where, good theories cross-validate. So here is a theory about attachment, about personality disorders, about relationships, but also it's a theory about abuse. Abuse has a fundamental message. The fundamental message is that you don't matter. So physical abuse is I hurt you, I cause you pain, that doesn't matter because you don't matter. Sexual abuse is I exploit you sexually, it messes up your ability to have intimate relationships, maybe your sexuality, your ability to have sex, all these different things. It don't matter because you don't matter. The emotional abuse is clearly you don't matter. You mess up your self-esteem. You learn to hate yourself, not to value yourself. And then neglect is you don't matter. So one of the strategies, ongoing strategies of every abusive person, is not just to abuse, but also to abuse your sense of worth. You deserve this. If you were good, you wouldn't be hit. If you hadn't wore that skirt, you wouldn't have been touched. If you had done what you're supposed to do, this wouldn't be happening. In other words, it's your fault. You're not worthy. Okay? And then what happens? This is analogous to, why do some, so this is, it jumps around, gives them two more theories. Why do some people have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from a traumatic event where somebody else who's right next to them experienced the same thing, doesn't have PTSD? So one of the theories, which is actually a theory about muscles and ligaments, is that if I throw out my shoulder at some point, it'll heal, but the ligaments have been stretched. Because they've been stretched, even though it's healed, they're also vulnerable to be stretched again, because they've been stretched once before. So that's a theory about PTSD, which is that somebody experienced something traumatic, and if they've had their psychic tendons, ligaments stretched from a prior traumatic experience, they're more prone to experience the new trauma more intensely and have PTSD. Whereas somebody else who has not had a traumatic experience, their psychic tendons are still intact and relatively solid from good attachment, good experiences of resiliency, having power and control of their lives. It's the first time. It's new. So PTSD is less often. So not feeling worthy, being told that they're not valued, and what happens when they're in high school and in college and they meet this charismatic, narcissistic person who not only charms them and seduces them, but when they occasionally annihilate them, hurt them, abandon them, cheat on them, they also say, oh, that's not what happened. That's not what happened. Well, what happened? What happens to children who are abused? They're told their reality is challenged, attacked by their parents. Tell them that they did this, they did that, and that didn't happen. So basically, their sense of reality, their sense of certainty is already challenged. So they doubt their own reality. They doubt their own experience. And basically, when they run across that charismatic, charming guy, they're highly vulnerable to that. And the reason they may be attracted to that charismatic guy is that as a compensation for being neglected or abused as a child within the family, they use the abilities that they had intellectually, physically, emotionally, spiritually, socially, to become really cool people, charming, effervescent, lovely people that drew a lot of attention. But the attention they got from relatively healthy people didn't work for them because they still needed to get, like what Dahlia was talking about, getting that figure to validate them. The narcissist who's inconsistent is the one that is to be convinced, like they couldn't convince they say they're bad. So they get, they're told as they're being annihilated. It's like a drug. They're told that they're wrong. They don't believe it. They don't have a sense of reality of their own experience. So they buy into it and they marry the dude. And then after 5, 10, 15 years of living together, being annihilated occasionally, the person cheating on them or not, but also having children, being valued in the community, being valued in the PTA, being valued by other parents, being valued at work. And they have this other feedback about their worth of the reality. After 5, 10, 15 years, they look over the guy and say, "You are a narcissistic asshole. The hell is this crap?" And they leave. So it's a developmental process for them to come to a reality that they don't deserve this and their experience is real. And they talk about the struggle to figure that out over that longer period of time. And if I'm meeting them, and my experience is them, at 40 years of age, they've already been through that. Sometimes therapy is the process that helps them through that reality. Sometimes other relationships like PTA, being at work, having good friends, and so forth, who tell you. I mean, probably all of you are friends with people that you tell them, more or less you tell them, you could do better than this person. You're more worthy than this. You shouldn't take this class. But they're not able to integrate it yet because this is old developmental. So there's that that fifth personality. That makes sense to you? I should ask you, have you experienced people like that? I've experienced actually quite a few people like that. And that's when the curiosity came up and I started asking them.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Anybody else experience like that?
Yeah, I have a friend whose husband is a narcissist, and that they're in the middle of something right now, and everything rings very much true.
Yeah, it's a challenge for the narcissist because there is this, because especially if you look at narcissism from the angle of attachment, and avoidant attachment is that they avoid going to deeper intimacies because they can't handle the vulnerability except to be hurt. But it doesn't mean they don't have attachment needs. They're too afraid to handle it, and they deal with it in a fashion that is by maintaining superiority, which defeats the mutuality and intimacy. And then the acting out where they have to punish and hurt the other person. If a person is healthy enough, they won't take it. If they get healthier, they also will evolve where they won't. It becomes problematic. They start fighting back. So in couples therapy, I've actually had, usually people who are narcissistic don't come to therapy. If they're really narcissistic, they don't come to therapy. They come to therapy because their alcoholism has gotten out of control. They've gotten fired enough times, or they're about to get divorced. And when they come to therapy, they're hard to deal with because they have often decades of the narcissistic compensation, and also maybe years and decades of doing it in the family, in the relationship. And to change it, it's like it's really changing the rules. And it goes back to that core old wound. Let's talk a little bit about, personality disorders in general are thought to be about rigidity, that people can't change them. And the premise with personality with borderline is that here's the theory, different kinds of theories. Also, what it's about. I tend to think of it as an attachment issue, where somebody needs attachment, they're desperate for attachment. They didn't get it for some reason from parents growing up, so they manifest it with somebody else. And there's a tendency for some of the borderline personality is to pick the wrong partner. Because if my need is that I couldn't get my parent to love me, respect me, let me know I'm valuable, for me to run into somebody who loves me, respects me, and thinks I'm valuable doesn't prove anything. I need to find somebody who is like that parent, who is neglectful, not validating, and make him or her, make them love me. That proves to me I'm worthy. So sometimes you'll interact with somebody who's borderline, and they'll tell you, how come, aren't there any good ones out there? And the answer oftentimes is there are plenty of good ones, but they weren't sexy. They weren't attractive to you. And you also block them by being preoccupied with this asshole, this knucklehead, for years. And these people pass in and out of your life wanting to be with you, wanting to develop a relationship because they weren't screwed up enough, because they didn't need to be fixed, which meant they didn't meet your need to fix somebody, make them love you, passed on them. So the borderline tends to find somebody who is often wrong for them. There's one dramatic relationship after another. And if you get somebody who's decent, they find somebody who is actually decent, they will interpret, because the betrayal, abandonment, rejection issues are so profound. Like I said, their sensitivity becomes hypersensitivity, their vigilance becomes hypervigilance, and both of those become even paranoid, and they interpret anything as fun. So now, with that dynamic, this is what I believe, that borderlines basically live out and assert. They live out and assert that they cannot suffer and survive. They live out that they cannot suffer and survive, that any experience, however nebulous, however small, that they interpret or overinterpret in some extreme fashion, hypersensitive, hypervigilant fashion, as betrayal, abandonment, rejection, that they have to jump on it because they're so devastated that they have to lash out. They can't tolerate it, and they have to lash out. So they cannot suffer and survive. Now, I believe my process of work, there's two major approaches to dealing with borderline. It's Kohut, K-O-H-U-T, and Kernberg, K-E-R-N-B-E-R-G. I think I got it right. Is that Kohut believes in, I might flip it too, but I think I have it right. Is that Kohut believes in creating in therapy very loving, accepting, unconditional relationship. Okay. Now, if you translate that to an intimate partnership, that means that you persist in being accepting, being loving, no matter how crazy that person is, no matter how mean, vicious, and reactive they are when they're hurt. So that speaks to therapeutically as a therapist or in a relationship, which you put up with a hell of a lot of crap. It also means that you allow yourself to be abused. I believe that's not just inappropriate. I think that's actually counterproductive. You do not develop a healthy relationship by allowing yourself to be abused. Just that doesn't make sense. And it doesn't work, which is also why the classic feedback I got from Chevy was like a lot of therapists hate working with borderlines, or they restrict how many borderlines they can work with, because they feel that they have to take so much crap from them. And they're so needy, and that it's their responsibility to somehow relieve these people from their suffering, because they're certain they cannot suffer and survive. And if you buy into that, then somehow you have to help them not suffer or relieve their suffering, as opposed to they can suffer and survive. In fact, not only they can suffer and survive, they must suffer and survive. That's essential. So Kernberg, which I believe I got the theorist correctly, has this opposite or different approach, which is much more boundary setting, much more confrontational, in saying that you have to deal with this. The boundaries are here. You may not be inappropriate. It's not acceptable. There's something called dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, that expresses some of these things. DBT, and you'll find this in your own experiences. As you study all these theories and stuff, some of them will make sense to you. Some of them you won't have time to get to. Some of them will be new and repackaged and so forth. My experience with DBT was that I knew it existed there. I've heard about it, and when I finally got around to actually studying it a little bit, oh yeah, I do this. It's really about boundary setting and holding somebody accountable. Now, that's not too surprising given that I come from a teaching background where boundaries are highly relevant to your kids. So, it's to anticipate that you can suffer and survive. They must learn how to suffer and survive. Okay? Now, what happens in a relationship if you are the partner of somebody who's borderline, if you take their crap, you take their lashing out, then you basically validate it. Now, what happens in those relationships is that you get these nice people who really are caring and nurturing, and they're accused of something awful. They get lashed out. They get brutalized by the borderline who was really hurt. And the partner who's made the mistake inadvertently is apologetic. Says, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to do that, and swears to avoid hurting the borderline again. But the thing is, that's impossible. That's impossible because it's not what the partner does. It's the fact that the partner's around and the borderline is hypersensitive and hypervigilant to that. So in trying to be nice and trying to be responsible and being loving, basically the partner indulges the mythology and supports the mythology that can't suffer and survive, and basically encourages and perpetuates the pathology of being borderline. What happens eventually is that the partner, try as they might, and wanting to believe themselves to be good people, keeps on trying, and then their sense of self-esteem is annihilated gradually because they keep on being told that they're being assholes, they're being horrible people, and then their sense of identity is being frustrated because they're not being heard and seen well. Eventually they go, the hell is this crap? I can't deal with this anymore. And they break up. And then the borderline goes, there you go, I knew it. Abandoned again, just like I thought. Rejected again, just like I thought. Betrayed, just like I thought. So because of self-perpetuating mechanism. As opposed to another approach, which is not accepting it. Not accepting it, which is basically, yes, you can suffer. Yes, you will be triggered. I will do my best not to trigger you. And when you are triggered, you will hurt deeply. Your instincts will be lashed out. And you need to find a way to suffer through it without becoming abusive to me. You have to. That's essential for yourself and essential for a relationship. And the language of it is, the lashing out is that somebody lashes out, partner says, wait a second. Something happened that you feel betrayed, abandoned, rejected. Whatever happened, we'll talk about it in a bit. I know I didn't do anything on purpose to hurt you. I might have done it by accident, but I know I didn't do anything on purpose. And we'll talk about it. And most of all, is while you're hurt and in a bad place, you may not abuse me. You may not abuse me because that will cause pain for me and for us, and the gradual accumulation of pain and resentments will destroy this relationship. And you can't handle it. You have to find a way to handle it without abusing me, without bashing out. So I'm here for you for that part, but I'm not here for you to punch me. And if I need to step away from you, I'll step away from you. And that's not me abandoning you, but that's me avoiding this toxic behavior, and getting worse. So now, as a therapist, that's the same thing. It's that. Now, one of and I'll get back to narcissism. One of the major setups as a therapist with someone who's a borderline is that basically the borderline comes in and works with you a little bit, and they're often lovely people. They're not triggered, very sweet, attractive in a lot of different ways. And then at some point, the classic line, after 2 or 3 or 4 sessions, they'll say to you, "You're the best therapist I've ever had." And if you're not careful and you're vulnerable to it, there's a part of you might go, "Oh, I'm the best therapist I've ever had. I'm special," which is feeding into your narcissism, your arrogance, because of course you want to be special. Well, a more astute response is awareness is to remember, no matter how good you are, no matter how talented and knowledgeable you are not immune to other people's crap. Their neurosis, their psychopathology, their issues. No matter how good you are, especially in the beginning, you are not immune to it. I am not immune to it. So they're narcissistic or borderline. They are narcissistic borderline. They're going to do it with me too. I'm just the latest in line of dance partners. Okay. So as soon as they say you're the best therapist I've ever had, you're so much better than other therapists. So my client actually happened. She said, "You're the best therapist I ever had." So I want to respond. I had a less sarcastic version of it. But I want to respond. "So, how many therapists have you had before me, and where are they buried?" Because something had happened. So I told her instead, I said, "Okay, how many therapists have you had before, and what happened with each of them?" So, after a while, it didn't work out. So if I want to be special, I go, I'm going to be the one who's going to be the good one. I'm going to be good for you. As opposed to her issues go beyond me. I'm not special. So I say to her, and this is what I did say to her, is that I said to her, having talked to you a little bit about your family and other relationships issues, I assume that you've had therapists before that have worked with you for a while, but at some point, they did something or said something that you felt betrayed, abandoned, or rejected. Just like with your family and other relationships, something happened that you felt betrayed, abandoned, and rejected. And then you killed the therapy. You either didn't show up, canceled, or some other way, annihilated. So what I want you to do is that when that happens with me, when that happens here, not if, when, because remember, I'm not immune to those. When that happens here, what I want you to do is you will instinctively feel, want to abandon me, punish me, shut me down, whatever. What I want you to do is to feel all that stuff and then come back and we can talk about it. Because that's really important to your process. So I anticipate it. Now, that is what's called a paradoxical intervention. And a paradoxical intervention has this particular effect, which is that if I make this form of paradox is prediction, if I predict that and she does exactly what I said she's going to do, in other words, she gets hurt and she abandons therapy, punishes me somehow that way, then her growth comes in having been called on it and then doing it. In other words, the reality is confirmed by her actions. And that could have therapeutic benefit. If, on the other hand, she resists the paradox, the prediction, then something different happens. And in this particular case, she resisted it. A couple of months later, she comes back to therapy. A couple of months later, we're doing ongoing therapy. A couple of months along it, she says, a few weeks ago, you said something that really pissed me off. And I was going to say, hell with this, I'm pissed off at Ronald. I'm not going to come back to therapy. But you said I was going to do that. And I didn't want to do that. So I came back. I said, what was it that I said or did? Let's deal with it. She goes, I don't even remember. But she broke the pattern of the behavior. You know, because I knew I wasn't special. You know, because thinking myself special, that would be my narcissism feeding into her borderline issues and so forth. So there's there's a mnemonic. See, is that just nailed again? Still can't do it. I don't know what I can do about it. Anyway, so suffering. I do a workshop about dealing with stress, and I use the mnemonic F F F S F S S F F F. What they stand for is how to become powerful. I use it for how to become a powerful child, but it's also relevant to the borderline process because the borderline says they cannot suffer and survive. As opposed to if you've lived life, if you've gotten anywhere in life, the realization is that suffering is something that happens in you and that you can survive. So the first S stands for stress. If you avoid stress, you avoid building yourself and getting stronger. Stress can be overwhelming, which is why parents and mentors and leaders are supposed to modulate your stress experience so it's something that you can handle. Something that I did learn and actually do remember from 30, 20, 40 something plus years ago at UC Berkeley was something called the locus of proximal development. The locus of proximal development says that when something is too easy, you don't learn, you don't develop. Something is too hard, you also don't learn. And there's this area called the locus of proximal development. It's hard enough to be challenging, but it's not so hard that it's impossible. This is where learning and growth happen. So, stress. So you allow somebody to have stress. In terms of attachment theory, in terms of proximity, nurturing, and consistency, is that a child or a baby wasn't given the opportunity to experience stress of waiting for a bottle, needing to be cuddled and interacted with, an appropriate balance of having stress and then also being taken care of. So in actuality, that means you need to stress people in order for them to be so strong. So therapeutically, that also means that as a therapist, you might need to challenge your clients, stress them by being difficult, by asking the uncomfortable questions. And then, the first F stands for frustrate. You need to experience frustration. If you avoid stress, you avoid growing. If you cannot tolerate frustration, then there's all kinds of stuff you're not going to deal with because you're not going to be successful. It just doesn't work that way. And then while you're stressed and you're frustrated, you also have to experience failure. People have to experience failure, because they find out that failure is okay, that they don't have to win time. So this actually relates to the other theory of narcissism. Remember I said that narcissism can be characterized as a deep, primary emotional wound, attachment wound of not mattering, and then the drive to be competent, self-worthy is what drives narcissism. The other way narcissism develops is parents who don't let their kids suffer, frustrate, or fail. They indulge them, and basically they tell them that I will keep you from ever suffering. I will prevent you from ever having a hard time. We will change the world to make it work for you. And that's where you get Veruca Salt, Violet Beauregard, Mike Teavee, and Augustus Gloop, the spoiled brats in Charlie or Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. They start to experience, that they'll always be taken care of. They want to suffer things. And they become intolerant, impatient, demanding, and needy. And, unfortunately, is that they get outraged when they don't get their needs met. And there's actually an underlying terror because they know the promise of never having to suffer is a false promise that cannot be fulfilled. And they go through life scared and angry that's going to happen to them. So they need to be stressed, frustrated, experience failure, and suffer. See, and there's the balance part of it. And suffer. Because remember, the borderline feels that they cannot suffer and survive. Betrayal, abandonment, rejection. Whereas the narcissist cannot feel that they suffer harm to their ego, harm to their omnipotence, competition and so forth. So they have to suffer and survive, which is sometimes the process of therapy. The process of therapy is what? Is that sometimes we talk about difficult things, people relive deep emotional, psychological pain, and they suffer through it. And in life, people suffer through it. The whole quarantine right now and the coronavirus, it could be so scary. And the majority of people are going to suffer through it. Okay? People cannot suffer through it. I've heard about people who thought they got the virus or did get the virus, and they committed suicide because they anticipated they could not suffer through it. But when you can suffer through it, it's different. Now, how do you suffer through it? Well, if you're doing it on your own, that's terrifying. But that's where parenting comes in, which is that with sensitivity, parents, adults, therapists can give support. With sensitivity, partners can give support. Okay? And sensitivity is support that's appropriate. I wear glasses, so I need these glasses. My glasses, I see Dahlia with her glasses, not the same prescription, I'm sure. So, sensitivity is this support versus that support, the right prescription. So some people need this way. Some people need a kick in the pants. Some people need to be handheld and carried. Some people need to be pointed towards, given a direction. It all depends. So you give them the support based on sensitivity. That's the art of the therapy. How much to do that? How much to challenge? How much to provoke? How much to support? How much to shut the hell up and let them talk? So with sensitivity, you give the support, and that's what effective parenting does in terms of create this secure attachment. And that's what, if there's failures here, failure sensitivity, because the parents are preoccupied doing other things, because of their addictions, their alcoholism, their other traumas and so forth, they fail to give the support the parent they need, then the insecure attachment, the personalities can come out of it. And here with a partner, does your partner do that for you? Are they tuned into you? Are they tuned into you to give you the support that you need? You don't need $100, a $500 birthday present. You need their time and attention. You don't need them to spend all day with you. Maybe you need them to check in with you so you know that they think you're important. You figure that out. Now, out of that sensitivity and support develops SS, strength and skills. Strength, which includes the capacity to handle stuff, but also the resiliency to tolerate things. And you only get that from having gone through stuff. And you also develop skills how to handle it. Part of the coronavirus issues in quarantine for me right now is that I have to activate all my psychic, emotional, spiritual, intellectual skills to keep my crap together because it's challenging. I'm doing fine in many different ways, but the overall pervasive stress that's going on is quite profound. So I have skills. And what are those skills? To compartmentalize, to be active, to be proactive, to relax, meditate, hold the dog, take a walk, break quarantine to go visit the donut shop and get a donut. I mean, whatever, There's different ways, and there's skills to do that, rationalization, so forth. And then, so if you use this principle, stress them, frustrate them, have them fail, let them suffer. Do it with sensitivity and support, so it's not overwhelming, and it's developmental and formative. And strength and skills develop, and then the person knows that they can survive. Remember, suffer and survive. You know they can survive. I can survive the quarantine unless I have bad luck to actually catch the virus and to have a severe reaction to it. I can survive it because I've survived before. Now, with that, if I have a baseline knowing I can survive, then I can flourish. I can make things happen. as it is interesting in terms of private practice. You know, some of my colleagues have suffered significant loss in their caseload and income because of the quarantine, people not coming to therapy and so forth. I haven't. In fact, I actually have more clients than I had before the quarantine because of things I built from before, but also some active and some new referrals based on things I did from before, but also some things I've done to create new referrals during the time of quarantine. So because of that, I'm actually flourishing business-wise in terms of that. But it also comes from the sense of skills, the resiliency, all those things. Suffer and survive. So therapy with a borderline is getting to suffer and survive. You know, but first you got to get them to accept that they have to suffer. Now that's also related to drugs and alcohol, because people with borderline personality disorders often have sexual abuse as part of background. That's not unusual. And also in compensations where the relationships are a way to self-soothe or desperation and pain. So is alcohol, drug, eating disorders, you know, money stuff, any number of dysfunctional behaviors. Alex says the therapist has to have the confidence and skills to know they can suffer and survive a borderline client. And part of that is they are borderline clients and you're not special. But then if you have a sound theoretical orientation, in other words, they will get mad at me. They will be hurt by me. You know, I'm not going to be special. Or if I'm going to be special, some version of being special, the specialness comes from I'm going to be aware that they're going to do their stuff with me too. And I'm going to be ready for it. So be surprised. You know, surprised and offended. So with that, you know, it's like, I don't know if you can see behind me. Yeah, right there, a picture of black and white. I have a nice one in my office, but right there, that's Alice falling down the rabbit hole. Borderline clients invite me to fall down the borderline rabbit hole. And I'm aware of it, so I avoid going down there. You know. So they're needy, they blame me. I try to be like a therapist stuck with water off his back. And this is what they're doing. They're gonna do that. You know. And then I hold that they can suffer. They can suffer. They can suffer. I'll repeat the three conjunctions: or, but, and. Or is one life or death, either or. But is one thing is less important than another, and is both exist. In other words, you can suffer and survive. You can suffer and control your behavior. You don't have to lash out. You know, you can have a series of bad relationships and grow and heal. You know, you can have that bad background and do this here. You can be mad at me and disappointed with me and still risk further engagement with me. Okay? You can have a really hard time, be devastated, and find the strength and resiliency to manage that. They believe they can. You know. So that's the kind of the borderline. Now the narcissist, maybe some characteristics. Compulsively try to assert superiority over the other person, including the therapist. The narcissist will respect anybody who unequivocally who can unequivocally prove themselves or prove themselves superior, especially in another non-competing realm. This is a huge challenge for therapists and people who try to approach each other in a humanistic, egalitarian way. You know, Mary Beth, I think that's exactly what you're talking about, because you try to treat people in this respectful way that you have the shared humanity, the shared experiences, and so forth. Well, they don't want to effing share with you. They want to be superior to you. You know, they don't want to be like you. Their sense of self comes from being better than you. So they got to prove themselves superior. I told you a story about the guy comes into therapy with his wife, And he spends the first 20 minutes questioning my credentials, all my credentials. And I'm answering them one after another. And I'm kind of, but I'm laughing at it inside because I know what he's doing. So I'm not put off by it. I'm not threatened, by his behavior. So I just answer questions after 20 minutes. I say, okay, if you finish questioning my credentials, let's do therapy. In the second session, he spends the first 20 minutes criticizing the first session. After 20 minutes, I answer all the questions and then ask him, if you finish criticizing therapy from last time, let's start therapy today. But I'm not surprised. See, and that's the real key. Don't be surprised. You can do that. Now, why is that such a big deal? Okay, just like why is the borderline such a big deal? Why is the narcissist a big deal? Big deal for slightly different reasons. The borderline, there is the issue of being special for both situations, but the borderline, you want to help. You want to help, you want to fix, you want to be the one. However, their whole personality mythology is they're doomed. They can't be helped. So that feeds into your sense of helplessness too. It makes you feel impotent. It challenges your very identity as a helping professional or a caring friend. So it's exhausting for you because, who are the fun clients? Who are the fun people to interact with? The ones that you do something and they tell you that there's growth and change. The story I told you about my client where I gave him the feedback about being abandoned by his parents, because of immigration and so forth. Then him realizing that he was so upset because he felt abandoned by his partner and his friends at the club. That was incredibly fulfilling. It made me feel like, God, I'm sitting there talking to them, but I want to jump up and I want to start dancing all over the room and I'm a therapist, woohoo, I am bad, I feel, because it's amazing. The borderline ordinarily doesn't give that to you, or they give it to you in this, you're the best therapist I ever had. They're wonderful. Then they're deeply disappointed in you. It's just not good enough. The therapy's not working. And so they actually withhold exactly what you might be desperately wanting to get from them. If you recognize that, you can manage that for yourself. It's the process. It's such a joke, but it's so true. A lot of times when I consult with therapists and they complain about their clients, and there's this metaphoric, implicit, why are they like that? The answer is because they're clients. If they were fine, they wouldn't be your client. So, just accept it. They're your clients. That's why they have that issue, because they're borderline. They're more than that too, but that's why they're there. So,
and perhaps the fact that they are there week after week, it means that they want to get better. They recognize there's a problem. There's a lot of people walking around that have all these types of disorders and they don't recognize that they have a disorder.
Yeah,
they don't want to change and they don't care about how they affect others. And I'm sure that plenty of feedback have been given to them about their destructive behavior, but they don't give a crap about changing or doing anything differently about their behavior.
This is actually a key difference between the two that we're talking about, borderline and narcissist. Borderlines are deeply invested, wanting to change. They're desperately wanting because they feel the pain, they feel the loneliness desperately. So the irony of it is that even though therapists complain about how borderlines will suck the life out of you, they also fill your coffers. They come to therapy all the time. And they'll pay you for it all the time. So whereas a narcissist won't come to therapy because they won't do exactly what you're saying, Dahlia. They won't own that they have their problem. Because everybody else is stupid, incompetent, and so forth. So they might be going through 3 marriages, a couple of being fired as vice president of this place or that place or whatever else, but they won't own it. That's a fundamental difference. So borderlines are invested, but it's like there's a trick to get them invested. But a narcissist is always going to, You know, so if you're a competitor, so if you approach them as equal, as somebody's comparable, it doesn't work. So this is the irony of it, which is that, you know, don't be a competitor. You have to assert your superiority. You have to support your superiority. And this is where I go into what I call my near narcissistic mode. I was a teacher. I also have some male energy, cultural training, and so forth. That's sort of supports the narcissistic, the hierarchical stuff. And in my life and history, I've tried to manage and modulate that appropriate. Here, I actually indulge in it because they need a superior. Because one of the theories about narcissism is just there is this deep emotional attachment need, and they are still desperately at a deeper level looking for leadership, looking to be parented. But you have to prove yourself worthy of being that parent and mentor. So you have to go to a superior stance of sorts. You know, in other words, especially if you are in relationships, you've done well in a relationship, you assert that. Also, you assert, I'm a marriage and family therapist, and you aren't. And you've been divorced 3 times. You know, so it's not working with you. You know, so here is what you need to do instead. And sometimes the assertion is, you just need a different point of view, because what you're doing is not working for you, and that's the challenge. You know, if the world is full of assholes, and that's the only reason why you're not doing well, well, you're probably at the top of the asshole with them. So there's a very very assertive near narcissistic stance that sometimes I take. I think I told you this story too before. Pretty funny. The couple comes in and he's just reeking of narcissism the whole time. You know, and I'm working with the 2 of them, just reeking of them. I can tell she's scared of him because he's so dominating. And I finally at the end of the session, I said, I want you guys to commit to 8 sessions, come hell or high water to couples therapy, no matter what. You just come. No, not coming to the therapy, stopping therapy. And he goes, why? Well, because I don't want you guys using coming to therapy or not coming to therapy as another weapon in your battle with each other. Because you already got enough ways to fight each other. You know? So that's why I want you to commit. And the other reason is that I don't want to spend the last 10 minutes of every session kissing your ass so you come back next week. And he looked at me, and his eyes got really big and scared. And he smiled. Because I asserted my superiority. I did it in a provocative way. And he goes, okay. You know, because I told him I'm not going to let him run the show. And that's one of the issues with a narcissist. When a narcissist comes to therapy, they want to run the show. Because they're the CEO, the CFO, but here they give them AO, you know, as far as you're concerned. You have to assert, you're the therapist. They're not the therapist. You're going to run the show. And they'll do anything to try to take over control. You cannot allow it. And you cannot allow, see, they will question your competence, they'll question your credentials, they'll question the process. You need to compartmentalize your need to get approval and to be liked and loved, to recognize that they need you to be strong. You know, they don't need to like you, they need to respect you in that situation. And the respect comes from doing some things that are more authoritative than you might be otherwise comfortable with. The therapist is passive. She can facilitate with often substantive feedback. You'll be dismissed. Okay. So also predict. When I told that guy, so I don't spend the last 10 minutes of every session kissing your ass and come back next week. Basically, I predicted his behavior. Sometimes when I work with somebody who's narcissistic, I will say to them at some point in the session, I purposely challenge you. I purposely challenge and disagree with you because you're pretty smart and maybe you're used to having people agree with you, but that doesn't really work long term. So I'm going to purposely disagree with you and challenge you. Can you handle that? Do you need someone to agree with you? Or can you handle me confronting you and challenging you? Basically, that becomes a paradox because I'm challenging you. Because either this person says, no, I need you to kiss my ass because I am essentially narcissistic, or they resist my prediction and they go, yeah, I can handle it. They rise up to the challenge. Interesting, but it doesn't always work. One of my clients that I got to come back since the quarantine started, I hadn't seen him in years. Signed out for one session, and wanted to get feedback about some prior therapy. And so, in the therapy itself, he said, and afterwards, and he's become estranged from members of his family. He said that they accused him of being narcissistic. And I remember talking to him about that in the session itself. And he had said that he's been to a couple of other therapists in other situations, and they say he's not narcissistic. And talked to me, and I basically said, well, there are these issues, and you have done these things. And then he terminated after one session. Which is essentially, I wouldn't just comply with him. Well, he was not looking for a therapist who would challenge him and facilitate his growth. He was looking for someone to validate his self-image, which was pretty fragile. He couldn't tolerate that. So that intervention being challenging, I told him, I think, you're opting to work with people that are agreeing with you on how you want to see things. Well, I believe that you need to be challenged, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to agree with you necessarily. I'm going to challenge you. And if you are able to handle that, I think it'll be very, very beneficial. Well, guess what? Yeah, I don't think he can handle it. So, it could work if you were less narcissistic, less fragile, but some people are that fragile. So, yeah, but other people who have narcissistic tendencies, I have done something very similar. And guess what? It's actually been this agreement. They accept it. They accept this more authoritative role. Okay. Let me run through each of you. I've been talking quite a bit. Let's run through each of you to get some feedback about what's been provoked in thinking, and let's go. On my screen, it looks like Dahlia, Nicole, Alex, Mary Beth, Stephen, and Pratik if your mic going. So.
Well, I want to say something. I'm not a therapist. I'm not going to ever be a therapist, but in just my daily life working with people, I can see a lot of people with those types of, tendencies, I mean, just every day, it almost like everybody has a tendency to be this way or that way. But they don't, but in my case, I'm not their therapist, in fact, they're my boss. They're my bosses. They are my, so how do I cope? Their people's behaviors affect me, so, and I'm not their therapist. How do I cope with people? I guess, on a day-to-day basis, given that everybody has a tendency to be this way or that way, how do you cope, especially when they're your bosses?
I have an answer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the two major ones we're talking about are borderline and narcissistic. Okay, so usually it's the narcissistic one that's more of an issue. But let's start with the borderline one. Is that first of all, one of the questions and prompts I use with my clients all the time is, what are the one or two key issues, key things that can trigger you, that throw you off, that put you to a spin, that get you really activated, upset, and so forth. There's usually only one or two of them. And oftentimes there's really just one. Everything is aversion. Okay. So as you hold that, if you interact with someone who's borderline, that's why I use a mnemonic BAR. It's really easy to remember. So there's an expectation of that they're going to be betrayed, being abandoned, or rejected. So what's the converse of betrayal? The converse of betrayal is that there is an implicit or explicit contract that will be honored. Okay, that you will honor the contract. What's abandonment? What's the opposite of abandonment? That you will hang in there. You will not go away or stay. What's the opposite of rejection? Opposite of rejection is acceptance. Okay? That I accept. So when you're dealing with someone who has borderline tendencies and vulnerabilities, then you always the strategy, the energy that you put out is that I will honor our contract. I will honor our contract and our agreements. And we need to make that contract and agreement explicit. The problem with the borderline is that they have implicit contracts that you violate without knowing they exist. Basically, the experience is of failing a test that you didn't know you were taking. Crossing a line that you didn't know was on the ground when you haven't even moved in any direction whatsoever. Okay? So if betrayal is a key issue, make the contracts explicit and make the contracts explicit and the expectations as clear as possible. That's what you do with some of the borderline issues. Abandonment, so that you won't go away. So you give the commitment that I will be here. I'm going to work this out with you. If I step away, I will be back. I step away to be productive. I step away to avoid negativity. And I will be back. I will not abandon you. You're not in this alone. Because that's the issue of abandonment. And then rejection is I accept your authority, especially as the boss. I accept your authority, your role. I accept my role. I accept you. I accept that this is something that we're going to do. So you approach with those based on those premises. This is why the mnemonics are so useful. You know, and you can see how it applies to therapy as well, to interrelationships as well. You know, if I have an issue over the years with my wife, you know, is that was there some implicit contract expectation that I violated? You know, and then sometimes the resolution of the argument fight is that we make explicit what was implicit. Because if explicit, then I could hold myself accountable for it. And you know, we've been together 47 years, so she's I'm not going to abandon her. You know, and rejecting, yeah, I'll get pissed. She'll get pissed occasionally, but then, you know, we fundamentally accept each other. So that's no longer an issue. Now, earlier on, it was. You know, so now with a narcissist, I'm going to give you something else. I call it the 5 A's. I don't know if I've said this to you guys before. It's the 5 A's. Because narcissism is tough to deal with. So the 5 A's in terms of dealing with it. The first A, I think I can type this in. The first A is avoid. If you can't avoid the situation, the circumstances, dealing with it, avoid. Because they're doing some narcissistic, competitive stuff, the rules and everything else. If you can avoid, avoid. Okay, now this is the 5 A's, but it's also hierarchical. If you can avoid, that's what's first thing you want to do. If you can't avoid, you acquiesce. Basically, you give in because it's minor BS. It doesn't really matter that much. It's something that is lightweight. It really doesn't matter to you. It's an emotional, spiritual victory to them. In other words, they parked their car over here instead of over there. They got this chair instead of that chair. You know, what the hell? You know, it doesn't matter that much. So let it go. It's bullshit. So the first two are definitely the best. Sometimes you can't do it though. You can't avoid. Sometimes you can't acquiesce. because it's a bigger deal than that. The third one is critical because this is a pivotal one. You artistically let them win. You artistically let them win. And artistically let them win is you understand who they are, what their drive is. Omnipotence, grandiosity, self-righteousness, entitlement, and a need to maintain image, to look good. Okay, so I'll give an example of this. A client is divorced, and there was a issue around child custody that his ex brought up. He didn't think it was reasonable or fair, but he could tell that she was pretty upset about it, pretty intense about it, and he wanted to know what to do. And the functional stuff is, I don't know, and I don't really care. But I talked to him about these 5 things, and number 3 was artistically let them win. You know, and he asked me, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, what is it that she really wants to do? Remember image? She wants to maintain an image." I said, "What image is that?" And I said, "I put it that her image, from what you said, is the image that she wants to put out is that she is the amazingly conscientious, on top of it, mom." He goes, "Yep, that's about right." I said, "Okay, can you present to her something that you find that is reasonable, that meets your needs, and is reasonable, that lets her feel that she has been the best mom possible?" And he starts smiling, you know. And I go, "What?" He goes, "I know exactly what to do. I know exactly how to put it." And then next week he came back and I said, "So what happened?" So I artistically let her win. And he smiled and says, "And I came up with something that was reasonable, you know, for her and for me and for the kids. But I artistically let her win, so she felt good about herself. And everything's cool." I said, "Awesome, cool." But and this is why the third one, artistically let them win, is such a big deal. Because if you can't do that one, then you have to do the next one, which is assert clear superiority. Clear superiority, if the law doesn't let me do this, I'm the one who, in the marriage family therapist, you're the one who's here for divorce. I'm the one who is sober. You're the one who has been fired from work for drinking. You know, I'm the one with this, with these credentials and these experiences, and you're the one who isn't. You know, or the law says I can do this. The law says you can't do this. Okay. You assert clear superiority. At this point, it's more antagonistic. It's more negative. You know, and you try to do this if you can. And if you can't do that, what's left? All out war. Go to battle. And there's ways that you can do that. But the first 3 are the key. Now, what is assert clear superiority? In one situation, I was supervising a social worker at a clinic, and he was leaving. He had resigned, and he had this issue with I was his clinical supervisor, but there's somebody else who was the administrative supervisor, and the administrative supervisor had this thing about him that they're concerned. And he told him, says, "You have to turn in all your notes. If you don't turn in all your notes before you leave, we're not going to cut you your last check." You know, so the guy that I was supervising clinically was really pissed off about that, and he talked to me about it. I go, "You know, I don't think this agency can do that. Call the tax people, call the government people." He called the government people. Guess what? The employment department, you can't do that. You can't withhold a check because of paperwork. So he looked it up. So order says, "You can't do that. That's illegal." So he asserted clear superiority, authority of the government. You know. So he got what he wanted. It's like also like, sometimes people share superiority about taking breaks, sick leave, vacation time, things like that. Legal requirements, things like that. Do that. But otherwise, getting this all-out war where you just do everything you have to do, it's really, really hard. And the reason some people avoid and void, but they avoid and they acquiesce not just to the simple stuff, but stuff that's really harmful to self, because they know that they have to go through this all-out war. So yeah, there's the 5 A's how you approach someone who's narcissistic. Hey Nicole, what's on your mind? What you thinking about? How does this resonate?
I think I was kind of just thinking about kind of fit of therapists, and it kind of sounds like, you may want like a therapist who can kind of like assert themselves. And so I was kind of thinking about just that, and like, some, I guess different therapists might have different kind of theories on that, or maybe it might be an area that one therapist feels better suited for than another. So that's just kind of what I was thinking about.
Something that's going to happen to you, possibly, because hopefully within a relatively short time, a year or two, you'll be in a practicum situation. And chances are they're going to assign you to kids, because that will make sense because of your age. And then there'll be this age range of people that they'll assign you to. They'll assign you to that's within your relative age range. And then there's this age range where you're going to run more into that narcissism, where they'll question you. And naturally what they'll do is they'll question you because of your age, because of that. So you'll need to anticipate how to handle that, because unless you're given a certain amount of credibility by your client, it's really hard to do any of the work. So that's going to be a challenge. But the other side of it is that if you end up working with middle schoolers and teenagers, and I started talking about the natural narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
Difference between the natural narcissism of adolescence and adult pathological narcissism is that middle school and high school age kids will be contentious. They will test you. They will check for your credibility. But they want you to be credible. They want you to be smart enough to know you and be wise and not to be scared by them and everything else. So they test you, but they want you to pass the test. They really are looking for leadership. Where a true narcissist usually shows you. So there's a thing about getting credibility with young people that actually does work pretty well. It's still kind of, when I stop to think about it, I'm 66, so I'm turning 67, and preteens and teenagers still really like me because of my funny stuff and my swearing and everything else, but also as part of the recognition is that I know they want good feedback, that's respectful, that's in tune to them, and I'm willing to do it. I don't pander to them.
Yep.
Alex, got any thoughts?
No. Not right now.
Okay. How about this artistically let them win part? Does that resonate in any kind of experience?
You're saying let them win?
Yeah.
Let them in. Okay, yeah.
Artistically let them win in a way that you get served and it was reasonable for you too.
No, I've used that before. It works.
Yeah, and that's why I think the term you use is really appropriate. About tendencies. The diagnosis. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes not. Because it really is. Of course, we have all those tendencies. This depends on how bad it is and how intense it is,
Yeah.
and when it gets triggered. I don't want to be betrayed, abandoned, or rejected. I want status. I have an image to maintain. I want to think I'm special. All this, that. This is just a how much.
Yeah.
How to create. So yeah. As you should, all of you should find in your studies is that you're going to get a lot of confirmation of life experiences that you've already had. That's just a labeling, conceptualization of real life experiences that resonate in memory and maybe in current situations.
Yeah.
Mary Beth, we got some reflections?
It sounds like one of the big things that working with borderline folks, one of the big things that's important working with borderline folks is setting clear boundaries. I mean, that's just sort of what I'm interpreting. The other thing is that when I was a union organizer, I really wish I would have understood narcissists better, because I would often have to like explain to the boss why they're like why they were in the wrong according to the law, according to the contract. And asserting superiority helped, but it was definitely, they did not respect us. And I'm just thinking maybe a good training for union organizers is how to assert yourself with narcissists.
Oh, hell yeah. Very relevant. Very relevant. See, and that's the thing about asserting clear superiority is that you could do that. Sometimes it's necessary to do that, but the narcissism still makes that difficult, which is why you have to go to the all-out war. Because remember, asserting clear superiority is based on the rules, and entitlement is the rules don't apply to me. Because I have the moral high ground. I'm special. I'm the best. And so that's why you have to go through this war thing, which is in the political realm is impeachment and lawsuits and all this other stuff, but also union work, the law, go to court, regulatory agencies and so forth, because it runs up against it. That's how powerful that entitlement is. Certainly, yep, definitely. Most definitely, I could adapt this training to union organizers. Stephen, what you got? What you think?
I guess what is kind of just standing out to me is just the vulnerabilities in these individuals from both, borderline and narcissist. I definitely, I guess, I really appreciate the idea of, suffer and survive, being able to do that. And that makes a lot of sense with someone who's borderline. And, if we're looking at it from an attachment theory, someone who doesn't, have, who doesn't have that stability, I guess, in a relationship. So that kind of makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that's pretty important to be able to establish, being able to just suffer and survive. And I think that kind of correlates across different, diagnoses or different issues that people are having mentally, just being able to suffer and survive. And then I also thought it was interesting for narcissists, just the, their fragile self-image is really kind of just a powerful idea to me, because, they're putting on such an opposite kind of front. They're kind of, the behaviors, they're really trying to hide that or compensate for that. And to me, it just seems like, that's a painful process to really overcompensate to that extent for, something that, for such a vulnerability. So that kind of just made me look at the idea of narcissism as, not so much trying to go head on with them, more like, I kind of want to, I don't want to say I feel bad for them, but it's like, you know, you're so hurt right now that you've got to overcompensate to such an extent. And I can see how, you know, you said, I can see how dealing with a narcissist can be tough, especially if you're, you know, getting all of this really grandiosity and, you know, them trying to, you know, assert superiority when in actuality, it's just a cover up for, you know, pain and vulnerability. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of it that I would definitely love to focus on more of, you know, therapeutically, how to approach someone who is, you know, really fragile, but comes off as they're not, you know. So no, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think, you know, maybe one of the things to really emphasize is what your vulnerability is to, you know, getting sucked into the borderline rabbit hole, getting sucked into the narcissistic rabbit hole. They're going to do what they do. That's part of how come. That's just who they are. That's why they are that way. And then that you know it, that you don't get sucked into it. I think I told you guys last time the story about the guy who was taking shots at me one after another, completely narcissistic. And I remember smiling to myself inside thinking, I know you're a narcissistic a-hole, and you don't. And I'm at a distinct advantage because I do know that you're a narcissistic a-hole and why you're doing what you're doing. And you don't. So it's pretty easy for me to handle it. If I'm in control of my need to get approval, be liked, be deferred to, be respected, you know. And as soon as I get to handle that, it's okay, I'm not going to get it from this person. You know? It's just not the same thing. And with that, that's a huge difference. Stephen, because you worked with kids and anybody else too, on this commentary about. But first of all, one thing to say about narcissism is that narcissism, interestingly enough, more recent theory is that narcissism, because personality disorders are considered lifelong, that with narcissism, that it can get better. People get less narcissistic. They can get less narcissistic as you get older. I think it's because narcissists do tend to be talented and competent. They get real accolades, real positives, and their need for affirmation eventually does get filled somewhat. So they need less to act out and prove it. But this other side of it, where it's not diagnosed in childhood because of a technicality, because it's not till you're 18. Your experience with kids, with other people too, your experience with younger people, and Nicole being 4 or 5 years removed from adolescence or high school itself, is what's your experience with younger people and the precursors to the personality disorders, particularly borderline and narcissism?
It's a good question. I'm trying to, you know, I guess you can kind of notice, yeah, maybe the lack of empathy, which is kind of strange because I feel like most children, that's almost instinctual from an early age, I guess, unless there's really that attachment issue. You know what I think that, you know, the younger, you know, elementary school, it's to have that narcissistic intention is, for me, is I've never really seen that established in kids that young. Maybe the older you get, the compensation comes in, but you can notice these, you know, certain behaviors that are quote unquote unusual for children that age, especially under the context of or within the context of attachment theory. So I guess you can actually begin to see these signs or behaviors a little bit more clearer when they're younger, because it is, you know, seems like, you know, it's a little bit out of developmental range for children younger to start to overcompensate or compensate for these lack of, you know, the lack of or fragile self-image or stability. The compensation seems to be not as elaborate, but the behavioral components of it seem pretty, maybe more overt. They're more out there. Kids that don't have that you know, stability tend to lash out and have, you know, these clear kind of expectations. If something doesn't work out, that kind of makes sense. I don't know. It's I just feel when they're children, the signs are a little bit more obvious. They haven't manifested into these greater things yet, but just certain behaviors and reactions seem to be a little bit more clear when they're younger, and you know, when they shouldn't be there. I don't know. That's kind of what I see with kids.
Yeah, I think you kind of both. In some ways, they're more obvious and more crude. But at the same time, they're also maybe more experimental.
Yeah.
Anybody else about the young one? Younger stuff? Ages? I would actually venture that a lot of that middle school drama of falling in love, breaking up, having heartaches, loss of love of your life, and then got a new partner next week, is that could be about anxious attachment on one hand, from one lens, but it also could be early manifestations of borderline-ish behavior, borderline issues, you know, because the intensity, it's probably developmental, but the intensity of the passion of being so devastated, so bonded, and then so devastated and so bonded again, you know. And for some of those people, then, you know, like replacing the love of your life over the weekend, you know, that might be that desperation of the borderline-ish precursors to borderline behavior. I mean, actually, as I'm saying that out loud, even though I've expressed it about the attachment before, is that if you look at people who are considered borderline as they're older, if you look back at them in middle school, as if they were doing something like that with their relationships then. And it's not just their boyfriend, girlfriend, or, you know, intimate romantic relationship types, but it also could be with close friends as well. Borderline people lose friendships as well as intimate relationships because of their intensity and their rationale. Because they get unforgiving, become unforgiving. Mary Beth, I bet you saw a lot of borderline people in the union work. Or borderline-ish behavior too.
I have a question for Mary Beth. What are a lot of like oppositional defiant people? There's a lot of people that I've worked with who complain a lot about management, who they kind of just can't take authority. They just they oppose authority even when it's benign, even when the authority comes at you from a good faith, benign kind of place. People that I've worked with who just can't take any form of authority. Those are the people that complain to the union about everything, even when it's a legitimate managerial activity. Do you see a lot of that in your work, in your unions?
So yes and no. And to Ronald's point, yes and no as well. So the people that are the most active in the union, I feel, for a lot of people, the workplace is an unjust workplace, and the union is a way to get build more power, collective power, and to really sort of right unjust, or like right wrongs. And so when you do have that, you do have, of course, people who are just naturally defiant. And those people, I think, take a little bit of a different approach. Somebody that comes to mind is this dude I worked with at one of the places I repped, and he was always getting into trouble because he didn't like the directives he was given. And they weren't, like they were like, he was supposed to do his job and those were the directives. And he just, he was just like, no, all of the time. And so somebody like that would probably have a defiant disorder, just because it is an objection to authority. Whereas other people I worked with who were the ones who were the stewards and the part of the leadership structure of the union, they saw the injustices that were going on and wanted to do something about it. So it wasn't that they were just naturally defiant. It was that there was legitimate issues at the workplace that they wanted to do something about. I've been thinking, I'm working on my crisis and trauma class right now. And one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is, can unions, I think, can be a form of trauma repair, and that they are empowering. And so I've seen a lot of people who were in abusive relationships and they got involved in the union and they left the abusive relationships because they had figured out how to push back, and they had just seen a different perspective. I think that, they built confidence, and they could see that life could be different. And as far as borderline, I don't think I saw a lot of borderline. I mean, I definitely did, just in interactions and representing a large group of people, but they weren't the ones who were the most active. I did see a lot of narcissists, but that was from the perspective of working with people who were in management. And that was the most that that was definitely very clear, that I worked with a lot of narcissists.
One of the percentages are relatively low, but it's like how dramatic people are and how obviously narcissists stand out because they do tend to go to these positions of authority, and there's you have to go to battle with them, so to speak. They'll stand out. But a narcissist, you won't be able to recognize a narcissist necessarily unless you're in those dynamics. They could be charming, they're not in conflict with you, so they just seem fine, charismatic. It might be a little bit egocentric, drawing attention, but it's not much. And even more so with a borderline type person. Unless they be betrayed, abandoned, the relationship allows for that to happen. They could be just they're notorious for being considered very positive, upfront, nice, quote unquote, normal people. So it depends on the relationship and the dynamic for it to happen. As an instructor, got wiser. There's people in the past that I'm pretty sure it's because of my role as an instructor, which is an authority figure of some sort, triggered stuff, And I imagine that outside of if I wasn't in that role, people wouldn't have been triggered, and because it's just not relevant, So yeah, I think it would depend a lot on the circumstances, and when you say narcissists, of course, yeah, those are people in management, and so forth, So it makes sense. I'm going to end with it. I just last straight thought, because when you talk about somebody who's really oppositional and defiant, I wonder if that could be a version of borderline. That they're related somehow. I got to think about that. That wouldn't. My instinct is that's possible, but I have to think about that. Anyway, I'll catch you guys later. Everybody stay safe. Stay safe, stay healthy. Take care of yourself and take care of the people and so forth.
Thank you,
All right.
Ronald.
Take care.
Yeah, Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Ronald.
All right.